Welcome to another episode of Swadeshi Videshi with me, Sudhanshu. And today, my guest is Arundhati Prasad, who is a art director here in New York City for an ad agency. Arundhati, it's good to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And you just started a podcast of your own.
That is right.
What's it called?
It's called Design for Good. And it's about people and creatives mostly who want to make a change in the world, somehow like impact social change and do good. It's basically like design for good. Good design for good is what I meant.
All right. That's nice. So, again, the viewers know this, but to explain to you, Swadeshi Videshi focuses on basically India from an insider and outsider's perspective. And I try to interview, people who are actually working on different issues, politics, policy, social issues, and then also interview, young people like us who are getting into it, who are affected by these issues, and kind of pick at different things in an insider-outsider perspective. Today, I want to talk to you about obviously politics, but not necessarily the dark, needy stuff that we talk about, but something that's kind of looked past, beyond over, and which is what you work on, design, and what you're passionate about, design and branding, when it comes to governance. Can you explain that a bit better for our viewers about like what you're really trying to do, what you're passionate about when it comes to kind of merging these two vast ideas? Because yes, we have a creative side that's really going out there, but when we think about India's governance, we talk about ease of governance, we talk about non-corruption, we talk of this, but especially how it impacts us, we don't really think and consider about design and branding and our cities and in our settings that we live in.
Absolutely. And so to start with, I think design is a very broad subject. Mm-hmm. It's not just like making something look pretty or making something look attractive and get attention. Yes, there are ways that you can do that through it, but the sole purpose of it is to solve problems, to think of creative solutions to better a situation. Mm-hmm. And in governance, as we all know, in administration, you come across multiple such situations where you have to solve problems. And whether or not people would like to accept it, there are ways that you can do that creatively. So my area of interest, and I'm sure there's so many people in the world who do it, and I'm sure people in India too are doing it. It's just that like we don't have a body in the government that sort of like says or acknowledges these people. But my area of interest is to design for the people who sort of who want to live in the cities that they inhabit, and they want to live well. They want to not get stuck in the logistics of getting to work or getting home, and like not feel frustrated in where they live or don't feel like things aren't they don't feel a sense of belonging, or like there's no sort of attachment to where they live. And it's more towards cities and the history of those cities. That's my interest, but there are so many different ways that design can impact it, whether it's about how you're being communicated to through the government, how are they getting information out to you, all of that is important. And once you use a tool like design, whether it's graphics or it's any kind of multimedia, and design for the people who you're governing, I feel like there is a total shift in the way they perceive the people who are governing them, the government itself. You don't alienate the people who are governing. You feel like they're doing things for you, and they're thoughtful about the way that they communicate to you. And coming back to what we're talking about, cities and how they need to be places where people feel a sense of belonging. I feel like there are two things that could happen there. One is the person who inhabits the city, like the citizen. Do they feel like they belong? Do they feel proud of where they live? And the second is the perception of the city to an outsider. So I feel like these are two very important things that in the future I would like to really kind of explore.
So just to clarify, we're not talking about, let's say, urban planning, smart cities, how people live within these cities, but more focusing on the design branding aspect of focusing on the identity of a city, the identity of people that belong in that city, and what you were talking about, that communication. So when we think about it, and what a lot of conversations that have occurred in India has been a lot about how we're living. So like if I have to go to point A to point B, what will I encounter within that area?
Yeah.
What can I use public transport? Do I have to use private? What are the modes and mediums, et cetera, et cetera. So that has been the real contention in terms of when we think about urban planning and development and all these schemes. Whereas not a lot of focus, I feel, has been kind of focusing on this, whether you want to call it heritage, whether you want to, and actually I'm going to take that back. There has been focus on redeveloping. You have the ASI, you have all these other different bodies where lacklusterly they do kind of rejuvenate like our history, our heritage, our identity, our traditions, physical and non-physical, and etc. And we have a Ministry of Culture. But what you're really thinking about and focusing on is the aesthetics, the vibes, and the communication part of it.
Absolutely. The overall identity of a city is what I'm thinking about. And this mostly comes from like the amount of time that I've spent away from my home city, which is Delhi. And I honestly, like, the more time I spend away from it, the more I kind of like learn to admire it for the history that it stands for the food and the culture and the people that live in it. And I've lived in a few cities over the past 5 years, and I felt like there have been cities that are wonderful and like have so much history and things to offer, and there have been cities that really don't, and but they've still been able to kind of establish this vibe or
cultivate like a identity of its
an
own,
identity, and they don't really have like too much heritage to speak about. But they have like a few things or a few attractions where they're like, oh, we have this, come, like pay like so much money and go see this like thing on top of a hill which is made like 10 years ago. And I'm like, I come from a city where like people who I don't know, I read this in a book somewhere that the only other city, the two cities in the world where if you dig up anywhere like 10 feet or something, you'll find something from like a different era, and it's either Rome or Delhi. And we don't realize that, we don't realize that like there's so much history that we're sitting on. Like we breathe it every day. Like, where I live, it's in Lal Kot. That's the first city of Delhi. I didn't know that till like much later. Like, it's not like we're taught it in school or made to feel like, it's so great that you're here. And I feel like we really need that. For Indian cities, there are so many things that you could offer. Like, there's a Delhi that's so different from Bombay. There's a Varanasi that's so different from a Bhopal, or a Zero in Arunachal that's so different from a Kochi in Kerala. Like, they're so different. Each city has so much to offer, whether it's the food, the language, the sites and the heritage. And there has to be, there have been campaigns. There are ad agencies that work on the campaign for states. Like, there was for the overall country, there's like, Incredible India. There's for Rajasthan, there's Jani Camel Jai, Big Jai, Jani Big Jai. For Kerala, there was God's Own Country, and Madhya Pradesh has its own. So, and they've done like a good job on that, just to get the perception right. But when you go to a city, do you feel like, oh my God, I've arrived in this place that like breathes some kind of like different air and has, there's so much to speak about, there's so much to do, but you don't ever like instantly get that feeling. And a lot of times we ourselves as Indians were tourists to these cities. And like, if you go to like a Pune, what's the first thing you see? Like, how do you separate a Pune from a Bombay? Do you know? No. Is there something that, and that's also because urban cities have somehow kind of taken a similar shape.
They're all the same, yeah.
They're all kind of boxing
themselves.
They all have a social, absolutely. They all have Starbucks now. But there's some kind of like box that they're fitting into, and they're losing the uniqueness that you would want to find. Like, I remember I went to Jodhpur for a short while, and we had a heritage walk in the morning. Like, my family and I, we decided to go on a heritage walk like early in the morning, and it was so beautifully done. And that's like one thing that kind of like emphasized this for me. Like I was like, I really need to kind of pursue something that engages young people who are visiting and whatever. So these group of like college students organized a heritage walk where you like,
which are in a lot of cities though.
In a lot of cities, and this was, and I've done it in Delhi before, and I've done it in a couple other cities, but I felt like this was so well curated. So it was early in the morning, and we biked around the Baulis and the main thoroughfare, which is which has bazaars and things like that. And there's a Ghanta Ghar. They have a little spot there where they're only like halwais, and they'll give you some chai. Like all these things were thought about, and we come from a history of detail of this kind. Like there's a space designated for halwais. Like there's a building that was constructed so that they can make their things with ease. Like all of that detail existed, but we've somehow kind of like lost that, or failed to acknowledge it, or like bring it forward because we're lost in like this general urban city.
Yeah. So one thing that I want to go back to is when a comparative aspect. So a lot of the viewers that might be listening, might have studied in the States, and the history that we're taught in the States, especially. It's so overdone, but then you think about it, and the time scale is only 300 years, less than 300 years, everything's wrapped up.
Absolutely.
A little bit more than maybe 315, that's about it, right? Whereas, that's just inching the surface of a city like Delhi, or, a city or civilizations that have occurred past in India, and we're still yet not able to, make it into something like so vast that it already is.
And it's just like a small example that I'd like to give is because we're in New York, and the I Heart New York campaign. So the person who designed the I Heart New York logo is Milton Glaser. He's a graphic designer, pretty famous, and till date we associate the city with that. We it's the Big Apple, it's the city of dreams, the city that never sleeps. There's so much. Not that I'm saying that it's not offering all of these things. It stands for a lot of things, and there are truths to everything that we believe. But it's the biggest branding campaign that exists, and it's right before you.
Right.
And I keep telling people who visit me or like whatever, I'm like, there's stuff to do. You can like go to the museums, you can eat at places, and they're like, but what else can you do in New York? I'm like, it's the feeling, It's the feeling of being here. And that feeling has been built over time with people buying into that story of I Heart New York, of the city of dreams, of the city that never sleeps. And it's built over very like conscious, curated efforts.
Yeah. So if that's what you're talking about, I mean, it would make it a lot easier for me, but also a lot of viewers. You said you're from Delhi, right? And comparatively living in New York, it's the I Heart, the audacity to dream, ambitious city that never sleeps. Compare that to if you had your way, a case study of Delhi. What would you brand it as? Well, what would these vibes be that you would give, or to someone that a layman like me, like what would you want to kind of give that as like someone
so obviously like it's like a pressure situation. I can't think of like a tagline off the top of my head, but I'm just saying that what we usually identify ourselves as people with big hearts, Dil Walon Ki Delhi, and
which they've tried
a little bit, but they haven't fully succeeded. Like if you ask somebody who's and people,
it's a radio jingle,
and people don't. If you ask somebody who's visiting India, they definitely will do the Golden Triangle, right? They'll land in Delhi, go to Jaipur, and do Agra, whatever. Do they come back with knowing that they know probably that Jaipur is a pink city, and Jaipur to an extent has tried that, like they've got Gandhi Bazaar that's like all fully like curated, nicely done, and whatever else. And there are places in Delhi that are trying to, like there's a Dharampura Haveli that has like a full facelift. You can get the experience of a Haveli there. In pockets it's happened, but there are markets like let's say Nehru Place or Connaught Place or like I don't know, Meherchand Market. You go to these little parts of Delhi or like South X and all of that, and over time I feel like they're all looking the same, with the same kind of hoardings, the same kind of stuff that's going up and down. So I feel I would definitely first highlight that this city has 7 cities within it. You go from one within the metro. I would somehow try and highlight that like you're crossing Lal Kot, going into Shahjahanabad, you're going to Purani Delhi, you're going to Tughlakabad or whatever, and it's not like you're trying to like warp into that time frame, but you should be able to be conscious that like you're living and breathing this,
right?
And there has to be some kind of difference in the way that it's structured. Like, you're entering this space and it looks slightly different.
But also preserving that space, because we're really focused on just tearing things down.
And building like cookie cutter buildings,
it frustrates me so much because I've seen this, especially in rural areas. So a lot of, let's say, these government buildings that were during the British time. So not just like, 1940s, right? But like 30s, 20s, 1910s. And, you have all these like significances that probably like occurred in these buildings because they were at that point, like a point of central.
Absolutely.
And now people just tear them down. The government is tearing them down to, have these cookie cutter like rest houses and government buildings and stuff of that nature without preserving them. There's no conscious effort to preserve these areas, even though it's a time that we want to kind of forget, like, but that in itself comes with history, right? That in itself comes with audacity for Indians to believe that, hey, this was here, we had the ability to go past that and beyond this and gain it.
I think another reason that we can't look at a city and say that, oh, this is this type of architecture that's in this city, or we associate cities with a monument, or like, let's say, oh, this is like an attraction or like a tourist attraction that we could go to. But because our culture is such that it's so we have Mughal influence. If you go down south, there's the whole Chola type of architecture. There's the in Hampi it's different. The Vijayanagara Empire, all these styles of architecture is so different that you can't call it all Indian architecture. You can't really kind of classify it like that. So I feel like when we construct new things, and this is more of urban planning that I'm not really an expert at, but when we construct new buildings, when we make new complexes for people to live in, like there's this, in the green flyover area, they're just building like new buildings for officers. I think I'm forgetting if it's like a metro enclave or something, but it's like a new building complex basically. And I feel like no thought went into that. Like, who is the architect they're appointing, like, to make it look like any other kind of dusty layered building? That wouldn't happen anywhere else, like, right. If they're going to make there has to be some sort of thought about how are we going to make this look aesthetic, or how are we going to make this look like it belongs to this city.
Yeah.
We don't have a skyline. We can't have a skyline. I'm not saying that that's the agenda. But there are ways to like unify the branding of the city. Right?
Yeah.
New York has a skyline. I'm not saying that we can at any point compare a New York to a Bombay or or any like American or foreign city to an Indian city, because they're so different at many levels. But there are so many ways to have a system that the city follows to unify the way that it communicates to the people who live in it and to the people who visit it. And I feel like that makes such a big difference.
No, I mean, that makes sense to me. But let's stay away from the urban planning, because that's none of our... But sure. Especially about the communication that these cities and especially the state, right, the system can do. You talked about, is there a city... Do you think, first of all, like you talked about state branding, right? The Jane Kya Dik Jaye, God's own country, etc. Do you think we're too large that we need to really focus on these cities, because these cities are so vast and different, right?
For sure.
I coming from Haryana, I know 2 or 3 cities, Kurukshetra, Panipat, at least, that go way beyond and are would be historic ancient, and then a very British era colonial time period of Karnal, which was like the British headquarters for Punjab at one point. So all these 3 cities in this very small state have such vast cultures and identities, but no one talks about it. I come here in New York City and I'll go to Union Square, and people from the BAPS whatever will be doing the Gita and all that stuff, and they'll know about Kurukshetra. Right, and then it's super hard to figure out that Kurukshetra is the place where the Gita was delivered, the sermon was delivered. They have this place called Jyotisar, where supposedly the tree where the individual like gave his sermon from. So these in a way this in the Western society where it's all been like, oh my gosh, this, and then in our daily lives it's just there in ruins.
It's sad in a way. It's sad, like there's it's no mystery that our country has content in every corner, you know.
Yeah.
You don't have to really try to find it. It's
You don't
right
need content
there.
creators. You just need to like,
need to like pick up something.
Yeah, and
right?
curate it.
Yeah, and I feel like that's the sad part is that because there's so much, people tend to
Push it to the side.
Yeah, push it aside, not value it as much, and I think it is important for individual cities to be branded also, because I mean, it's a big country, the states are big, and within the state there's so much. Like, you can't, you know, you'll say like, okay, within Rajasthan you can say that, oh, you know, there's a Jaisalmer, a Jodhpur, or Jaipur, or Udaipur, and there's no like end to this. But each city is so different. You know, they had different rulers, they had different food, dance and clothing, all of that varies. So I think there's enough content to sort of like, you know, in cash, or like not in cash, it's the wrong word, but there's enough content to explore and say that, you know, I can make a system or like a story for each city, and that's totally possible. Yeah, okay, because like let's say Rajasthan as a whole already has some kind of a brand through that campaign, they can stick to that, but the city has its own, you know, like governance, has its own administration. They can totally put in the funds or the efforts to brand it, to have some kind of identity. And like you said, is it important to have cities or states branded? I think this whole like narrative of the smart cities that we spoke about, that also focuses on cities having an identity, and smart cities are mostly for tier 2 cities, so you know, there'll be like a Kochi or a Bhubaneswar or wherever, and apart from there being like, you know, more public spaces and better infrastructure, one thing that they sort of mark out as a feature is that the city has to have an identity. It needs to be unique. People need to be able to associate the city with something they saw, something they ate, or an overall vibe. And that vibe obviously is created by people and, you know, their shared history, language, culture, all of that. And I feel like it's an exchange. People will feel that if you make them feel like they belong, and they need to feel proud of where they live to be able to kind of like promote it to other people who are visiting.
Oh, fantastic. So last question. You know that we are during an election period at this time, and by the time this podcast releases, we might not know who the next government is or about to. I want to know, you know, if you wanted to recommend something for the next government when it comes to design and branding, what would you want to do? A suggestion, something that we could really work on.
So obviously I can't speak for the whole country because it's too big and we should start small at first, but I feel like federally even each sort of state, city, town, area that has its own, you know, we you know, the thing is that we do have certain systems in place. It's just the implementation of those systems that we've always kind of like fallen short, and that's the problem with our system. It's just that like we're not able to implement all the things that we write down and kind of promote. Right. I would say that there definitely needs to be a governing body that promotes design and branding of any space, and sort of like figures out what people want, what is the like, what's the culture they're breathing, you know, and be able to translate that on the street so that people feel a sense of belonging from where they come from. If you ask somebody from like, let's say Hong Kong, like, you know, what is it about, like what's Hong Kong about, they'll give you a list of things, you know, like we can do this, and we go, you know, like there's a whole culture about the trains in Hong Kong, or like even in New York. There are all these things, and that culture exists in Delhi too, but we need to be able to package that well, and that's so important. And I feel like with the coming government, I think, I mean, obviously I don't want to get into like who's coming in or whatever, but it's just that I feel like they really need to stress on having a body or like a group of people who decide the look and feel, the aesthetic, the design sensibilities of the city.
So you're proposing a Ministry of Design?
Absolutely. That's what I was getting at. A Ministry of Design. We definitely need it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Arundhati, for coming on, and I hope you enjoyed the little conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
And we'll be back next week with another episode of Swadeshi Videshi. And until then, keep listening. I hope you enjoyed the conversation that we had today. We're bound to make mistakes, but we'll only learn and get better from here. Now, if you want to take part in Swadeshi Videshi, any questions, suggestions, or just want to tell me how much you love Swadeshi Videshi, you can contact me on Twitter at Sudhanshu Kaushik.